If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and tap like before we get started. Because this channel is where the women nobody saw coming get the endings they actually deserve. Adrienne Walsh was standing in her own driveway holding a box of her mother's china when the locksmith van pulled away and she finally understood what was happening. The front door of the house she had lived in for 11 years was propped open with a moving dolly. Two men she did not recognize were carrying her reading chair down the steps and setting it on the wet grass like it was garbage waiting for pickup. Her clothes were already out there, still on hangers, draped over the porch railing in a long, humiliating row for every neighbor on Ashford Lane to see. Her late mother's china was the only thing she had managed to grab before someone locked the study door in her face. She stood there in her work clothes, heels sinking slightly into the lawn, and watched strangers empty her life onto the grass, while her husband stood in the doorway with his phone in his hand, not even looking at her, texting someone, as if she were a delivery he was waiting to sign for. For one strange, suspended second, standing there in the wet grass, Adrienne's mind pulled her backward 11 years to a different afternoon entirely. A small courthouse wedding neither of their families could afford to make grand. Preston, in a rented suit that fit him slightly wrong through the shoulders, promising her in a voice that cracked with nerves that he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never regretted choosing him over every safer option she had. She remembered believing him completely. She remembered the particular warmth of his hand at the small of her back as they walked out of that courthouse into ordinary daylight, two people with nothing yet, and everything still ahead of them. That memory did not soften anything happening in front of her now. If anything, it sharpened it, because the gap between that nervous, grateful young man and the one standing coldly in the doorway told her exactly how much of him had been performance all along, and exactly how much of her own life she had spent believing in a version of him that had perhaps never fully existed at all. Preston Walsh finally looked up when she said his name. He was still in his suit from the office, tie loosened, and there was nothing on his face that resembled the man she had married. No guilt, no discomfort, just a kind of flat, finished expression, like a man closing a spreadsheet. "You knew this was coming," he said, before she could ask a single question. "I've had the papers drafted for 3 weeks. I'm not going to pretend to be sorry, Adrienne. I gave you 11 years. That's more than most men would have given a wife who stopped contributing anything real to this marriage a long time ago." Behind him, a woman appeared in the doorway wearing Adrienne's silk robe, the pale blue one, with her initials stitched at the collar, a gift from Preston, their 5th anniversary. Melanie Cross, 29 years old, Preston's newest junior partner. Adrienne had trained her. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Melanie did not look away when Adrienne's eyes landed on her. If anything, she straightened her shoulders, one hand resting on the doorframe like she already owned it. "Preston, babe, is she almost done? We have the fund walkthrough at 7. Fund walkthrough. Adrienne felt something cold settle behind her ribs, because she knew exactly what that meant. Melanie was not just sleeping with her husband. Melanie was being groomed to sit in the chair Adrienne had built for Preston with her own hands, her own unpaid nights, her own quietly discarded career, back when Walsh Vance Capital was 4 employees crammed into a rented office above a dry cleaner, and Preston did not yet know how to read a term sheet without her help. "I built that firm with you," Adrienne said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I read every pitch deck for the first 6 years. I found your first 2 hires. I sat up until 3 in the morning modeling out your Fund 1 projections while you slept, because you were too anxious to look at the numbers yourself." Preston's jaw tightened, the only crack in his composure. "That was a long time ago. You quit working the second I could afford for you to quit. You've spent a decade doing nothing, Adrienne. Charity boards, book clubs. Meanwhile, I built something real. Melanie understands the business. She's sharp, she's hungry. She's going to make partner in 18 months on merit, not because someone married into it." The word landed exactly where he wanted it to land. Adrienne had given up her own CFA track at 28 because Preston had begged her to help him get the firm off the ground, had promised her a partnership stake once things stabilized, a promise that had quietly evaporated year after year while she raised his profile, ran his household, and buried her own name. She had not always been so easy to isolate. In the early years of the marriage, Adrienne had been close with her younger sister Camille, close enough that they spoke almost every day, close enough that Camille had been her maid of honor at that small courthouse wedding. It had been Preston, gently at first, and then less gently, who had begun suggesting that Camille was a bad influence, too dramatic, too demanding of Adrienne's time and energy, when Adrienne needed to be focused entirely on supporting the firm through its fragile early years. Adrienne had let the calls with Camille grow shorter, then less frequent, then almost non-existent, telling herself each time that it was temporary, that things would go back to normal once the firm stabilized. A stabilization that never quite arrived because there was always a next milestone, a next fundraising round, a next reason her own life needed to shrink a little further to make room for his. Standing on that lawn now, she understood with sudden, uncomfortable clarity exactly how deliberate that shrinking had been, and exactly whose interests it had always served. "You have 1 hour," Preston said, already turning back toward the house. "My lawyer will reach out about the divorce. Try not to make this messy in front of the neighbors. It won't help you." He shut the door. Through the front window, Adrienne watched Melanie slide both arms around his waist, laughing at something, already comfortable in a house that still had Adrienne's wedding photos hanging in the hallway. A woman 2 houses down had come out onto her porch with her phone raised, filming. Another neighbor had slowed his evening jog to watch. Adrienne stood very still in the grass, china box balanced against her hip, and made a decision in that exact moment that would define the rest of her life. She was not going to give any of them the sight of her falling apart on a lawn. She loaded what she could into her car in silence. Most of what remained on the porch belonged, technically, to Preston, purchased on cards under his name, even if she had chosen every piece. Her half of 11 years fit into a hatchback with room to spare, which told its own quiet story about how thoroughly she had erased herself into his life. She had exactly $140 in a checking account that was mostly Preston's, a car with a half tank of gas, and nowhere in particular to go. Her parents were both gone, her father 4 years now, her mother a decade before that. She had let her closest friendships thin out over the years, mostly at Preston's quiet insistence that her old friends were beneath where they were headed, and now, standing in a stranger's evening on a street she no longer belonged to, she understood exactly how alone he had left her. She drove until the tears blurring her vision made it unsafe to keep going, then pulled into an empty church parking lot and let herself cry the way she had not allowed herself to cry in years, not during the miscarriage nobody ever spoke of again, not during the 2 affairs before this one that she had convinced herself she imagined, not during any of it. When the crying finally slowed, she wiped her face in the visor mirror and reached for her wallet to check exactly how little money she had left to survive on. That was when a card slid out from behind her driver's license, a card she had not touched in 9 years and had nearly forgotten existed. Matte black, no logo she recognized beyond a small embossed compass symbol, the edges worn soft from a decade in a wallet. Her father had given it to her the year before the diagnosis that would take him 18 months later. Walter Coleman had not been a warm man, exactly, but he had been steady, precise, and almost pathologically private about money, a trait Adrienne had always assumed came from growing up with nothing. He had pressed the card into her palm on a Sunday afternoon while her mother was in the garden, and told her, in the flat, unemotional voice he used for anything important, not to activate it unless her life required it. "You'll know the day," he had said. "Don't waste it protecting your past. Save it for whenever you finally have to build your future from nothing." She had asked him what was on it. He had told her that wasn't the point yet, and changed the subject, and she had never pushed, because pushing her father on anything financial was like pushing on a locked door. This, she thought, sitting in a dark church parking lot at 9 at night with a box of her mother's china in the back seat, was very clearly the day. She searched for the institution printed in small letters along the card's edge, a private banking office downtown she had never once set foot inside, and found that it stayed open for wealth clients until 10. She fixed her makeup as best she could in the visor mirror, straightened the blazer she happened to still be wearing from work that morning, and drove across town with a strange, hollow calm settling over her, the calm of someone who has already lost everything and therefore has nothing left to be afraid of losing. The lobby was marble and hushed, the kind of quiet that only exists in rooms built for people with real money. A single associate remained at the private desk, A young man named Colin who looked faintly annoyed at being kept past close until he actually read the card. His posture changed instantly. He asked her to wait one moment, walked briskly to a glass-walled office in the back, and spoke in a low, urgent voice to an older woman inside, who stood up so fast her chair rolled backward into the wall. The older woman came out smoothing her blazer, introduced herself as Regina Voss, Senior Private Client Director, and asked Adrienne, with unmistakable care, to please come into her office. "Before we go any further, Mrs. Walsh, I need to verify your identity properly," Regina said, once the door was closed. Adrienne handed over her license with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Regina typed for a long moment, glanced at her screen twice like she was rereading a number to make sure it was real, then turned the monitor slightly so Adrienne could see it too. "Do you know what your father set up for you before he passed?" Regina asked gently. "No," Adrienne admitted. "He never told me the details, just that I'd know when I needed it." Regina nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are about to say something that will permanently divide someone's life into before and after. "Mrs. Walsh, your father was not simply a private investor. For the last 32 years, under a holding entity called Coleman Meridian, he was the founding and controlling limited partner behind Highline Ventures. Are you familiar with that name?" Adrienne was familiar with that name. Highline Ventures was the seed fund that had capitalized Walsh Vance Capital in its earliest, most fragile year, back when Preston could not get a single bank to take his business plan seriously. She remembered Preston coming home electric with relief the night the term sheet was signed, remembered him saying he had no idea who the money actually belonged to, only that it was routed through an anonymous holding structure and a silent partner who never once asked for a board seat or a meeting. Just quiet, reliable capital, and a single voting right written into the original documents that nobody at the firm had thought much about in a decade, because it had never once been exercised. "Your father was that partner," Regina said. "He backed dozens of firms this way over the years, always anonymously, always through Coleman Meridian. Upon his death, his entire limited partner interest across every one of those holdings, along with the associated voting rights, transferred into a trust in your name. It required this exact card, physically presented, to activate your access. Until tonight, everything has remained dormant." Regina turned the screen fully toward her. "Your total position across the Coleman Meridian portfolio, as of this evening's mark, is just over $51 million. Within that portfolio, you hold a 49% voting interest in Highline Ventures specifically, which under the original fund documents, functions as an effective blocking minority on any new capital raise. I understand your husband runs Walsh Vance Capital. I want to be direct with you, Mrs. Walsh, because I think you need to hear it plainly tonight. You did not simply inherit money from your father. You inherited the ability to stop his firm's next funding round in its tracks, the moment you choose to." Adrienne sat very still in the leather chair, absorbing a sentence that rearranged everything she thought she understood about the last decade of her life. Her quiet, unreadable father, the man who drove a 12-year-old sedan and clipped coupons out of habit long after he no longer needed to, had spent 3 decades secretly building the exact kind of leverage that could dismantle the empire her husband had just publicly humiliated her to protect. He had never told her. He had simply waited and trusted her to find it the day she truly needed it, and he had been right about the timing down to the hour. "Why didn't he ever tell me any of this while he was alive?" Adrienne asked quietly. Regina's expression softened. "I asked him something similar once. Years ago, when he came in for his annual review. He told me money given too early gets absorbed into someone else's life. He said he wanted you to inherit it only at the moment you needed to become entirely your own person. He said, and I remember this specifically because it struck me, that he was not leaving you money, he was leaving you a door, and doors only matter once you actually need to walk through one." Regina pulled up records stretching back 3 decades, showing Adrienne a pattern that read, once laid out fully, almost like a quiet life story her father had never once thought to tell her directly. Coleman Meridian's earliest investment had been a small manufacturing company in 1994, funded with what amounted to nearly all of her father's modest life savings at the time. A bet that had paid off slowly and steadily over the following 6 years, and funded every investment that came after it. There had been failures too, entire companies that folded within a year or two, money that simply vanished the way early-stage investing so often demanded. But her father had never chased losses or panicked, simply recalibrated and moved forward with the same flat, patient discipline he brought to everything in his life. "Your father treated this the way most people treat a hobby they're deeply serious about," Regina said. "Never showy, never boastful, just steady, careful attention over a very long period of time. It's honestly one of the more remarkable portfolios I've reviewed in my career, precisely because almost no one outside this bank ever knew it existed." They spent almost 2 hours going through the structure of what she now controlled. Immediate liquid access sat at just under $6 million, with the remainder held across a diversified 32-year portfolio of private holdings, real estate, and passive equity stakes that Regina strongly recommended she not touch without proper counsel. Adrienne opened new accounts entirely separate from Preston that same night: a personal checking account, a savings account, and a credit line, each one a small, deliberate act of becoming someone who no longer depended on a single soul for her own survival. Regina gave her a personal cell number and the direct line of the firm's head of wealth strategy, a woman named Patrice Odom, and told her, shaking her hand at the door, that her father had been the most quietly disciplined client she had ever managed in 26 years, and that protecting his daughter now felt less like a job and more like an honor. Adrienne left the private bank a little after 11 at night and sat in her car in the parking garage for a long time, staring at her new bank card under the dome light. Then she opened her phone and booked the presidential suite at the Marbury, the most expensive hotel downtown, for 2 weeks, without once checking the nightly rate. The lobby was all soft gold light and hushed piano music. The desk clerk did not blink at her tear-streaked makeup, or the fact that her only luggage was a cardboard box of china, because the card she handed over spoke a language every luxury hotel understood instantly. The suite itself was larger than the primary bedroom she had shared with Preston for a decade, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the entire skyline, a marble bathroom with a soaking tub deep enough to disappear into. She ordered a full dinner from room service, ate slowly at the window with the lights of the city spread out below her, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, felt something that was not quite happiness yet, but was at least the very beginning of it. Before she allowed herself to sleep, she opened her laptop and did 2 things. First, she searched for the most formidable divorce attorney in the city and found a woman named Catherine Boyd, whose website described her, without a hint of modesty, as someone who did not negotiate. She dismantled. Adrienne sent a message requesting the earliest possible consultation and got a reply within 20 minutes, offering 9 the next morning. Second, she searched for private investigators specializing in financial infidelity and hired a firm run by a woman named Renata Ford, whose reviews were unanimous in praising her thoroughness. Renata called her back within the hour, her voice calm and businesslike even at midnight. "Tell me what you need," Renata said. "I need to know everything my husband has been hiding," Adrienne said. "Every dollar, every trip, every lie. Start tomorrow." There was a brief pause on the line, then Renata said, quietly and with something like respect, "Understood. You're going to want to be sitting down when I bring you the first report." Her phone buzzed once more before she finally slept. A text from an unknown number that could only be Preston. "Don't drag this out and make it ugly in the papers. You have no money for a real lawyer and no case. Sign what I send you and this can be simple." Adrienne read it twice, felt nothing but a strange, distant amusement, and deleted it without a reply. Let him believe, for a few more days, that she was exactly as powerless as he had left her on that lawn. The truth would arrive on its own schedule, and it would arrive in a form he could never have imagined possible. If you're enjoying this one so far, tap that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear stories like Adrienne's. Adrienne woke the next morning to sunlight pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows and, for one disorienting second, forgot entirely where she was. Then the last 24 hours came rushing back in full, the china on the lawn, Melanie in her robe, the number on Regina's screen, and she sat up in the enormous bed with a clarity she had not felt in years. She ordered breakfast, opened her laptop, and reviewed Renata's engagement contract line by line before signing it electronically and wiring the retainer without hesitation. $5,000, an amount that would have caused her real anxiety 2 days earlier, registered now as barely a ripple. At 9 sharp, she sat across from Catherine Boyd in a downtown office of glass and steel, the city's river visible behind Catherine's shoulder. Catherine listened to the entire story without once interrupting, her pen moving steadily across a legal pad, and only looked up when Adrienne mentioned, almost as an afterthought, the true size of what her father had left her. "Say that number again," Catherine said. Adrienne said it again, and added the detail about the blocking minority in Highline Ventures. Catherine set her pen down entirely and allowed herself, for just a moment, an unmistakable smile. "Mrs. Walsh, your husband threw you out onto a lawn in front of his neighbors while you were sitting on leverage that could end his firm's next capital raise before it starts. I have handled a great many divorces in this city. I do not think I have ever enjoyed one in advance, the way I am about to enjoy this one." Catherine explained the strategy in plain terms. Because Adrienne's inheritance came from her father and was structured in an irrevocable trust that activated before any marital discord existed, it stood entirely outside the marital estate, untouchable by Preston, regardless of how his lawyers tried to frame it. Preston, meanwhile, would have almost nothing of substance to claim, since the marital home and joint accounts represented only a fraction of what Adrienne now controlled independently. Catherine recommended a clean, fast filing, an even split of only the true marital assets, and, if Adrienne wanted it, an explicit refusal to request or accept a single dollar in spousal support, a move Catherine promised would land like a slap once Preston's lawyers understood what it meant. Adrienne agreed to all of it without a second's hesitation. She did not want Preston's money. She had never wanted his money. She wanted, more than anything, for him to finally understand exactly who he had discarded. That evening, Renata called with the first update, her voice carrying the particular flatness investigators use to soften bad news before delivering it. "Your husband is not careful," Renata said. 24 hours in, and I already have him and Melanie Cross at 3 restaurants, 1 boutique hotel, and an apartment building downtown that isn't in either of their names. It's held under a shell entity, but the payments trace directly back to a Walsh Vance Capital business account. Adrienne felt the floor tilt slightly under a new kind of realization. He's paying for her apartment with the firm's money? For at least 14 months, based on what I've pulled so far, Renata confirmed. And it isn't just the apartment, client dinners that were actually dates. A business trip to Turks and Caicos that never touched a single client. A watch, a handbag, both coded as investor gifts. I'm seeing roughly $90,000 in the last year alone that has nothing to do with the business. I'd bet real money there's more once I get deeper into the last 3 years. Adrienne sat with that for a long moment, staring out at the skyline from her suite. Preston had called her dead weight on that lawn, had said she contributed nothing real to the marriage or the firm, while quietly funneling the firm's own capital into an affair he had been running for well over a year. The hypocrisy did not even surprise her anymore. It simply confirmed what she had already begun to suspect, that the man she married had never actually valued honesty, only control, and had lost his taste for her the moment she stopped being useful to maintaining it. Renata explained, patiently, how she had built the picture so quickly, walking Adrienne through the unglamorous mechanics of her work, the way a surgeon might explain a procedure to calm a nervous patient. Public court filings and business registrations had led her to the shell entity holding the apartment lease within the first few hours. Credit card statements, once properly subpoenaed through Catherine's office, filled in the rest of the timeline with a precision that left almost no room for Preston's lawyers to argue interpretation later. "People assume this kind of work is dramatic," Renata said. "Mostly it's just patience and paperwork. People who think they'll never get caught tend to leave the clearest trail of anyone, because they never bother covering it." Adrienne found something almost soothing in the plainness of that explanation. The reminder that the truth, once someone was willing to actually look for it carefully enough, rarely stayed hidden for very long. "Keep going," Adrienne told Renata. "I want every dollar, every date, every lie, before this goes anywhere near a courtroom." She hung up and sat with her tea cooling beside her, thinking not about Preston, but about her father. About 32 years of quiet discipline poured into a structure he never once mentioned at the dinner table, built entirely so that his daughter would have exactly this kind of ground to stand on the day she needed it most. She understood now why he had lived so simply, driven that old sedan, clipped his coupons out of habit rather than necessity. It had never been about the money for him. It had been about making sure that whatever happened to her, She would never again have to stand on someone else's lawn, wondering where she was allowed to go. 2 days later, sitting in her hotel suite reviewing invoices from Catherine's office, Adrienne's phone lit up with a name she had not seen on her screen in almost 3 years: Camille. Her thumb hovered over the call for a long moment before she finally answered. Her sister's voice came through tight and worried, having apparently heard secondhand through a mutual acquaintance about the scene on Ashford Lane, the video one of the neighbors had posted having quietly circulated further than Adrienne realized. "Why didn't you call me?" Camille said, not quite a question, more of an accusation wrapped around real fear. "I saw the video, Adrienne. People are saying he threw your things on the lawn. Where are you right now? Are you safe?" Adrienne, sitting in a hotel suite that cost more per night than her old grocery budget for a month, found herself laughing and crying at almost the exact same moment. "I'm safe," she said. "I'm more than safe. I have a lot to tell you. And I'm sorry, Camille. I let him talk me out of you for years, and I never should have." They talked for nearly 2 hours that night, the first real conversation the sisters had shared since before Adrienne's wedding anniversary 3 years earlier, and by the end of it, Camille had booked a flight for the following weekend, unwilling to wait any longer to see her sister in person. When Camille arrived, she pulled Adrienne into a hug at the airport curb that lasted long enough to draw a few curious glances from other travelers, and neither of them cared even slightly. Over dinner that night, at a quiet restaurant Adrienne chose specifically because Preston had always hated it, Camille finally said the thing she had apparently been holding back for years. "I used to call you sometimes, you know," Camille admitted, turning her wine glass slowly by the stem. "Back before things went so quiet. I'd call, and you'd sound so far away, even when we were talking about nothing, and I told myself I was imagining it, because you always insisted everything was fine. I should have pushed harder. I'm sorry I let him make it easy to disappear from your life instead of fighting to stay in it." Adrienne reached across the table and took her sister's hand. "You didn't do anything wrong, Camille. I made myself easy to lose. That was me, not you, and I'm the one who's sorry, for every call I let go to voicemail and every excuse I made for why I couldn't visit." They sat with that honesty for a while, the kind of honesty that only comes easily after enough time and enough distance from the person who benefited from keeping them apart. By the end of the night, they had already made plans for Camille to fly back the following month, and this time neither of them treated it as a special occasion requiring advance notice weeks in advance. It simply became, quietly and without ceremony, a normal part of both of their lives again, exactly the way it should have remained all along. Rebuilding that relationship would take longer than a single dinner, both of them aware of the years of distance sitting between them, but the door, once reopened, never closed again, and Camille would go on to become one of the steadiest presences in the new life. Adrienne was only beginning to imagine that night, a reminder that some of what Preston had taken from her could, with patience, still be recovered. 3 days later, she met with Patrice Odom, the wealth strategist Regina had recommended, and spent an entire afternoon mapping out what she actually wanted to build, now that she finally had the resources to build anything at all. She did not want to simply live off the interest for the rest of her life, however comfortable that might be. She wanted purpose, the kind her own career had been quietly denied for over a decade in service of someone else's ambition. She told Patrice about the years she had spent, unpaid and uncredited, modeling out Preston's earliest fund projections, structuring his first term sheets, mentoring analysts half her age who eventually outranked her on paper while she remained, officially, nothing more than the founder's wife. "I want to build an advisory firm," Adrienne said. "For women specifically, women rebuilding after divorce, after being pushed out of businesses they helped build, after being told for years that their contribution wasn't real. I know exactly what that gap looks like because I lived inside it." Patrice smiled and began sketching out numbers on a legal pad. "That's not just a good idea, Mrs. Walsh. Based on what you've described about your own background, you are precisely the person the market has been missing." Patrice walked her through scenarios that stretched decades into the future, showing her what her position could look like if she simply held everything as it was, invested conservatively, and never touched the principal, against what it could look like if she deployed a portion of it deliberately into building something of her own. "Most clients who inherit at this scale do one of two things," Patrice told her, sliding a printed projection across the table. "They freeze, terrified of losing what someone else built, or they burn through it, trying to fill a hole that was never really about money in the first place. You don't strike me as either type, Mrs. Walsh. You strike me as someone who wants to actually build something you can put your own name on. Adrienne appreciated the bluntness more than she expected to, having spent 11 years surrounded by people who spoke to her in careful, managed half-sentences designed never to upset Preston's version of events. She told Patrice, plainly, that she wanted enough held safely to never again depend on another person for her own survival, and the rest deployed towards something that mattered, and Patrice nodded like that was exactly the answer she had been hoping to hear. Within a week, Adrienne had leased a modest but polished office suite downtown, close enough to Walsh Vance Capital that she could see its glass tower from her own window if she chose to look, which she made a point of doing exactly once a day, not out of longing, but as a private reminder of exactly how far she had already come. She named the firm Coleman Sterling Advisory, using her mother's maiden name Sterling alongside her father's, deliberately erasing Walsh from the only name that would matter going forward. Her first hire was a sharp young analyst named Priya Nair, laid off 8 months earlier from a firm that had passed her over for partner 3 times despite her results, purely, as far as either of them could tell, because she had once taken maternity leave. Her second hire was a former paralegal named Denise Cole, who had left the legal field entirely after her own divorce drained both her savings and her confidence. Adrienne built her team deliberately out of women the market had quietly discarded, because she understood better than almost anyone exactly what that particular discarding felt like, and exactly what those women were actually capable of once someone finally handed them a real chance. Her first client came through a referral from Catherine Boyd, a recently divorced surgeon named Dr. Vivian Okafor, who had spent 15 years letting her husband manage every dollar of a 7-figure estate and had no idea, in the aftermath, where to even begin protecting herself. Adrienne walked her through every account, every hidden fee, every blind spot her ex-husband's financial advisor had quietly exploited for years. And by the end of their first month together, the surgeon had recovered nearly $200,000 in mismanaged assets she had not known to look for. Word moved quickly through the kind of circles where women compare notes about lawyers and money managers in hushed, careful voices. Within 2 months, Coleman Sterling Advisory had 11 clients and a waiting list. Growth like that did not arrive without resistance. A rival wealth management firm downtown, run by a smooth, aggressive man named Corbin Lang, who had once tried unsuccessfully to poach 2 of Preston's own analysts years earlier, began quietly telling potential clients that Coleman Sterling was unlicensed, unproven, and unlikely to survive its first year. A whisper campaign that reached Adrienne only when Dr. Okafor called to ask, with genuine concern, whether any of it was true. Adrienne responded not with anger but with transparency, publishing her full licensing credentials, her audited results for every client account, and a straightforward statement inviting any prospective client to verify everything independently before signing on. The whisper campaign collapsed within a month, and 2 of the clients Corbin Lang had been actively courting switched to Coleman Sterling instead, unimpressed by a competitor who needed to lie about a woman just getting started, rather than simply compete with her. Not every client arrived at Coleman Sterling Advisory with a simple story. In the firm's 3rd month, a woman named Bethany Cruz came in for her intake appointment, visibly shaking, glancing repeatedly at the door as though someone might be following her, and it took nearly half the session before she admitted that her estranged husband had discovered she was meeting with a financial advisor and had begun calling her repeatedly, warning her that any attempt to secure her own finances would end badly for her. Adrienne recognized the particular fear in Bethany's voice, not identical to her own experience, but close enough in shape that she understood exactly how to respond. She did not simply proceed with the financial plan. She connected Bethany that same afternoon with a domestic violence advocate Catherine Boyd kept on retainer for exactly this situation, helped her quietly open accounts at an institution her husband had no relationship with, and personally walked her through documenting every threatening call in case it became necessary for a protective order later. Bethany's husband called the Coleman Sterling office directly 2 weeks later, his voice cold and threatening on the phone with Denise, demanding to know what right they had interfering in his marriage. Adrienne took the call herself, calm and unhurried, and informed him plainly that his wife was a client entitled to full confidentiality, that any further contact with the office would be documented and forwarded to both the domestic violence advocate and, if necessary, law enforcement, and that his call that morning had already been recorded for exactly that purpose. He did not call again. 6 months later, Bethany finalized her own divorce with full financial independence secured well in advance. And she stopped by the office unannounced one afternoon, simply to say thank you, bringing a small potted plant for the reception desk that Denise kept alive and thriving for years afterward. A small green reminder in the corner of the lobby of exactly why the work mattered. Her fourth client walked in wearing a Walsh Vance Capital lanyard she had clearly forgotten to remove, a junior associate named Faith who had quietly saved a modest inheritance from her grandmother and wanted, in her own words, to make sure it never ended up in the hands of a man the way she had watched happen to other women at the firm. Adrienne recognized the irony immediately and said nothing about it, and simply did her job with the same care she gave every client, because that, more than anything else, was the entire point of what she was building. Preston's firm still believed, as far as she could tell, that she had vanished quietly into whatever small, humiliated life he assumed a discarded wife was supposed to live. He had no idea that his own junior staff were beginning, one careful referral at a time, to walk directly into her office instead. That week, Renata called with an update that made Adrienne sit down before she finished the sentence. "I have the full 3-year picture now," Renata said. "Your husband has run just over $230,000 of personal expenses through the firm's accounts. The apartment, the trips, jewelry, a car registered as a company vehicle that Melanie has been driving exclusively for the last year. I have receipts, statements, photographs, everything cross-referenced and time-stamped." Adrienne absorbed the number in silence for a moment. "What happens if this reaches the firm's other partners?" she asked. "Best case for him, they force a resignation and demand repayment quietly to protect the firm's reputation," Renata said. "Worst case, they report it, and he's looking at fraud charges, given the dollar amount involved. That's really their call to make, not mine. I just gather what's true." Adrienne thanked her, hung up, and sat with the decision for exactly one night before calling Catherine Boyd in the morning. "Send everything to his partners," Adrienne said. "Anonymously, through counsel, not through me directly. And make sure the divorce filing itself references that we possess evidence of financial misconduct during the marriage, enough to make his lawyers understand exactly what leverage we're sitting on if this goes anywhere near a courtroom." Catherine's approval was audible even over the phone. "That's not just smart, Mrs. Walsh, that's surgical. I'll have the package assembled and sent to Walsh Vance Capital's compliance officer by Thursday morning, and papers served to your husband that same afternoon. He is going to have an extraordinarily difficult week." Adrienne felt no triumph saying it, only a kind of settled certainty, the same flat clarity she had felt standing on that lawn refusing to cry in front of her neighbors. She was not doing this out of revenge exactly. She was doing it because the truth, once she finally had the power to release it, deserved to exist in the open rather than remain buried the way she had spent 11 years burying every uncomfortable thing about her marriage for the sake of Preston's comfort. Preston Walsh sat in his office on Thursday morning reviewing quarterly numbers when his assistant knocked twice, her voice unusually tight. "Mr. Vance wants you in the conference room immediately." Gerald Vance, Preston's co-founder and the closest thing the firm had to a chairman, rarely summoned anyone without warning, and never in the tone Preston's assistant had just used. Preston straightened his tie out of habit and walked down the hallway with a knot already tightening in his stomach. Inside the conference room, Gerald sat flanked by the firm's general counsel, a woman named Priscilla Hart, and the chief financial officer, a careful, precise man named Wallace Grimm. None of them were smiling. A single folder sat closed on the table in front of Gerald's seat. "Sit down, Preston," Gerald said, and something in his voice made Preston obey without argument. "We received a detailed and thoroughly documented report yesterday afternoon regarding financial irregularities in your expense activity over the last 3 years," Priscilla said, opening the folder. "Approximately $232,000 in personal expenditures coded as business activity. An apartment lease, international travel unconnected to any client engagement, jewelry and a vehicle registered as firm assets. We have receipts, statements, and photographic documentation, all independently verifiable." Preston felt the blood drain slowly from his face. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, his voice thinner than he intended. "Someone is trying to damage me. This is clearly fabricated." Wallace slid a printed spreadsheet across the table without a word. Preston recognized, with a sinking, sickening clarity, his own handwriting in the margin notes of the original expense reports. "We're placing you on immediate unpaid leave, pending a full independent audit," Gerald said, and the disappointment in his voice was somehow worse than anger would have been. "You'll surrender your firm laptop, credit cards, and building access today. You are not to contact clients, staff, or limited partners during the investigation. Depending on what the audit confirms, this may proceed to a formal termination and restitution demand, and potentially further action beyond that." Preston opened his mouth to argue and found, for the first time in his professional life, that he had absolutely nothing to say. He gathered his belongings under the silent, watchful eyes of colleagues who had spent a decade admiring him, and by the time he reached the parking garage, his phone was already buzzing with a message from an unfamiliar law office, confirming that he had been served divorce papers at his residence that same afternoon. He sat in his car outside the office he had built from nothing, the office Adrienne had quietly built with him from nothing, and read through the divorce filing with hands that would not stay steady. It cited infidelity. It cited financial misconduct during the marriage, discovered and documented, ready to be presented in full should the proceedings require it. It requested a clean, equal division of only the true marital estate, and explicitly, almost insultingly, requested no spousal support whatsoever, which told him, more clearly than anything else in the document, that Adrienne no longer needed a single dollar from him. He called her number 4 times. Each call went straight to voicemail. He texted her twice, the second message edging towards something close to pleading, and received no reply at all. Whatever power he believed he still held over her life had evidently already evaporated, sometime in the handful of days since he had watched her drive away from that lawn, and he had no idea yet exactly how completely. Gerald Vance sat alone in his office, long after Preston had cleared out his desk that afternoon, staring at the folder Priscilla had left behind, thinking about the young, hungry analyst who had walked into his office 14 years earlier with nothing but a rough business plan and an anxious, brilliant wife doing the real work quietly in the background. Gerald had met Adrienne exactly twice in all those years, both times at holiday parties where Preston had introduced her briefly before steering the conversation back toward clients and numbers, and Gerald found himself now, uncomfortably, remembering the specific competence in the 2 or 3 questions she had asked him about the fund's structure on each occasion, questions sharper than most of his own junior partners ever managed to ask. He wondered, sitting there in the quiet of his office, how much of the firm's early success had actually belonged to a woman none of them had ever properly credited, and he did not much like the answer his own memory kept offering him. That night, Melanie sat across from him at the kitchen table of the house that would soon no longer be his, scrolling through her phone with an expression he had never once seen directed at him before. "People are saying you're being investigated for fraud," she said flatly. "Is that true?" "It's complicated," Preston said. "It's temporary. It'll get resolved." "How am I supposed to pay my rent if you're not getting paid?" Melanie asked, and there was nothing soft left in her voice at all, only the cold arithmetic of a woman, recalculating whether the man across from her was still a worthwhile investment. Preston stared at her for a long moment and understood, with a clarity that arrived roughly 11 days too late to matter, exactly what kind of partnership he had actually traded his marriage for. If this story is hitting for you, drop a comment letting us know. We read every single one, and it genuinely helps decide what story we bring you next. The divorce hearing took place 6 weeks later in a courtroom that felt, to Adrienne, almost anticlimactic after everything that had led up to it. Catherine Boyd sat beside her in a charcoal suit, calm and unhurried, while across the aisle Preston sat beside his own attorney, looking noticeably thinner than Adrienne remembered. His suit slightly loose at the shoulders, dark circles beneath his eyes that no amount of concealer could fully hide. Preston's lawyer opened by requesting spousal support on the grounds that Preston was currently without income pending the outcome of his firm's internal review. Catherine rose without hurrying, laid out the trust documentation establishing Adrienne's inheritance as separate existing property entirely outside the marital estate, and noted, evenly, that Preston's current unemployment was the direct result of his own documented misconduct, rather than any circumstance attributable to Adrienne. Preston's attorney pressed further, arguing that 11 years of unpaid contribution to Preston's business should itself entitle Adrienne to a portion of the firm's enterprise value, an argument Catherine dismantled within minutes by pointing out that no such contribution had ever been formalized in writing, precisely because Preston himself had never followed through on the partnership stake he had once promised. Preston himself spoke briefly during the proceedings, at his attorney's evident reluctance, insisting to the judge that he had built Walsh Vance Capital through his own vision and effort, and that Adrienne's role had been, in his words, largely supportive rather than substantive. Catherine did not even need to respond directly. She simply entered into the record a stack of emails, preserved from the firm's earliest years, in which Preston himself had described Adrienne's financial modeling as, in his own writing, the backbone of everything he had managed to build. The judge read 2 of the emails aloud without comment, and Preston's attorney visibly deflated beside him, sensing correctly that the argument had just collapsed entirely under the weight of his own client's earlier words. The judge denied the request for spousal support without much further deliberation at all. Asset division moved quickly after that. The marital home, valued at just under $600,000 with a remaining mortgage of $190,000, would go to Preston, who would need to refinance within 60 days to buy out Adrienne's half of the equity, a task that would prove considerably harder than usual given his current employment status. The joint checking account, holding roughly $18,000, would be split evenly. Preston's retirement account, accumulated across the marriage, would be split according to standard formula. None of it touched a single cent of what Adrienne now controlled through Coleman Meridian, exactly as Catherine had promised from their very first meeting. Within 30 minutes, the judge had finalized the terms, dissolved the marriage, and adjourned the hearing, and Adrienne walked out of the courthouse into a bright, ordinary afternoon, feeling lighter than she had felt in longer than she could accurately remember. "You're officially free," Catherine said, shaking her hand on the courthouse steps. "For what it's worth, in 22 years of practice, I don't think I've ever watched a client walk into a divorce with quite this much quiet power, and use it quite this precisely. Your father would be proud of how you handled this." Adrienne thanked her and meant it fully, then drove back to her office, where Priya and Denise were waiting with a modest cake and a card signed by the entire small team, because Coleman Sterling Advisory had, by that point, become the closest thing to family Adrienne had left standing, alongside Camille, who called that evening the moment she heard the news, insisting on flying in the following weekend just to take her sister to dinner and finally say, out loud and in person, how proud she was of her. That evening, Renata called with a final, almost offhand update. Walsh Vance Capital had formally terminated Preston that morning, and the firm's board had voted, given the scale of the misconduct, to refer the matter to outside counsel for possible criminal referral rather than pursue only internal restitution. Melanie Cross, facing her own potential exposure as a beneficiary of the misused funds, had already retained her own lawyer and was reportedly cooperating fully with the firm's investigation in exchange for limited immunity. "Do you want me to keep tracking any of this?" Renata asked. Adrienne considered it for exactly 1 moment before answering. "No," she said, "I'm done. Whatever happens to him now happens without me watching." She meant it, and to her own quiet surprise, she found she actually could let it go. The months that followed unfolded with a kind of momentum Adrienne had not felt in her own life since long before her marriage. Coleman Sterling Advisory grew from 11 clients to over 30 within a single year, built almost entirely on referrals from women who had experienced some version of what Adrienne had lived through, women who trusted her precisely because she had rebuilt her own life in full public view rather than quietly disappearing after her divorce. She hired a 4th team member that spring, a soft-spoken but relentlessly precise accountant named Marisol Reyes, who had spent a decade being passed over for promotion at a larger firm despite training 3 separate managers who eventually outranked her. Marisol had nearly turned down the interview entirely, having been told so many times over the years that she lacked the presence for a senior role that she had genuinely begun to believe it herself. Adrienne recognized the pattern instantly, because she had lived a version of it for over a decade inside her own marriage, and spent the better part of the interview simply asking Marisol to walk through her actual work rather than sell herself, watching her come alive the moment the conversation moved away from performance and toward substance. Marisol turned out to be one of the sharpest minds Adrienne had ever worked alongside. catching a six-figure reporting error in a client's old portfolio within her first 2 weeks that 3 previous advisors had somehow missed entirely, and within a year, she had quietly become the person the rest of the team turned to whenever a client's numbers refused to make sense. The team Adrienne assembled, one careful hire at a time, began to feel less like a company and more like a small, fierce family, built entirely out of women who had once been told, in one form or another, that they did not contribute anything real. They celebrated the firm's first $1 million revenue quarter with an unpretentious dinner at a restaurant 2 blocks from the office. 5 women who had each been quietly discarded somewhere along the way, raising glasses to a business none of them could have built alone. And Adrienne found herself thinking, watching Priya nearly cry laughing at one of Denise's stories, that this loud, messy, deeply loyal table felt more like a real family dinner than any formal Walsh Vance Capital gathering ever had in 11 years of trying to make herself fit inside one. By the start of its second year, Coleman Sterling Advisory had outgrown its original suite entirely, and Adrienne made the decision to open a second location 2 hours south, in the smaller city where Dr. Okafor had since relocated, and where demand for exactly the kind of guidance the firm offered had grown steadily through referrals alone. She promoted Priya to lead the new office, a decision that surprised Priya more than anyone, given how recently she herself had been the one walking into a job interview, convinced no one wanted to take a chance on her. "You're ready," Adrienne told her, over coffee the morning she offered her the role. "I know that because I remember exactly what it felt like the day someone finally decided I was ready too, and I'm not going to make you wait as long as I had to wait to hear it." Priya cried a little in the coffee shop, unashamed, and accepted before Adrienne had even finished the sentence. The second office opened that autumn with 4 new hires, all of them women referred through the fellowship program or through word of mouth among clients who had come to trust the Coleman Sterling name implicitly. Watching Priya run her own opening day, confident and composed in a role she once would have assumed was permanently out of reach, Adrienne felt a particular, quiet pride that had nothing to do with revenue projections at all. It was the same feeling, she realized, that her own father must have felt every year he quietly funded some fragile new company through Coleman Meridian without ever once asking for credit. The specific satisfaction of watching someone else finally get the chance they had always deserved. She launched a modest scholarship fund in her father's name that same year, the Walter Coleman Fellowship, offering free financial literacy training to women re-entering the workforce after divorce or widowhood, and personally reviewed every application herself, because she remembered exactly what it felt like to sit in a parking lot at midnight with no idea how a single dormant bank card might change the rest of her life. Within the fellowship's first year, 43 women completed the program, several of them going on to start their own small businesses with guidance from Adrienne's own team. One graduate, a widow named Odette who had never once had her name on a single bank account in 30 years of marriage, opened a small bakery 8 months after completing the fellowship and mailed Adrienne a box of the first batch of cookies she ever sold, with a note that simply read, "You gave me back my own name," and Adrienne kept that note framed on her office wall from that day forward. She was profiled that spring in a regional business magazine under the headline "The Quiet Comeback," an article that focused entirely on her professional rebuilding and mentioned her divorce only in a single restrained sentence, exactly the way she wanted it. She did not need Preston's downfall to be part of her own story anymore. His downfall belonged entirely to him now, the way it always should have. Reading the article at her desk one afternoon, surrounded by a team she had built out of women the market had once quietly discarded, Adrienne felt something settle inside her chest that she recognized, after a moment, as genuine peace, the first she had felt in longer than she could clearly remember. It was at a fundraising gala for a local literacy nonprofit, nearly a year after that terrible evening on Ashford Lane, that she met Theo Marsh, a landscape architect responsible for the redesign of the city's riverfront park, tall and easy in a way that felt refreshingly unforced after a decade spent managing Preston's carefully performed charm. He complimented her fellowship program specifically, having apparently read the magazine profile, and asked thoughtful questions about how she structured the financial literacy curriculum, rather than simply offering vague praise the way most people did at these events. They talked for nearly 40 minutes before either of them noticed how much time had passed. He asked for her number with none of the practiced smoothness she associated, uncomfortably, with Preston at that same age, and she gave it to him without the hesitation she expected to feel. Their relationship developed slowly, deliberately, over the following months. Coffee turning into dinner, dinner turning into long, unhurried weekends. Each stage arriving only when Adrienne herself was actually ready for it, rather than when someone else decided she should be. Theo never once pushed, never once made her feel behind schedule on her own healing. And that patience, more than any grand gesture, was what finally allowed her to trust him. He met Priya and Denise at the office one afternoon, bringing coffee for the whole team unprompted, and Adrienne watched him charm her fiercely protective staff within 20 minutes, which told her more about his character than any single conversation could have. He met Camille not long after, the two of them bonding immediately over a shared, slightly overprotective concern for Adrienne's well-being that made her laugh harder than she had in years, watching the two most important new relationships in her life fold so easily into each other. One evening that autumn, Theo drove her out along the river to see the section of the redesigned park he had spent the better part of 2 years working on, a stretch of walking trails and native plantings that had transformed a neglected stretch of waterfront into something the whole city had started using on weekends. He walked her through it slowly, pointing out small details most visitors would never notice, the way certain trees had been positioned specifically to frame the sunset, the drainage system disguised as a decorative streambed, and Adrienne found herself moved by the sheer patience the work represented. Years of careful, unglamorous planning, producing something that would quietly improve people's lives for decades without most of them ever knowing his name. "This is sort of what you're doing too," Theo said, as they sat on a bench watching the light change over the water, "building something that outlasts you, that helps people who'll never know exactly how much thought went into it." Adrienne had not thought of her own work in quite those terms before, but sitting there beside him, she recognized immediately that he was right, and that being truly seen by someone, in exactly the way Preston had never once managed to see her, felt like its own quiet kind of homecoming. He introduced her to his parents a few months later, a warm, unhurried dinner at their house that felt nothing like the careful, performative gatherings she remembered from years of Walsh Vance Capital fundraisers, and his mother pulled her aside in the kitchen at one point, simply to say that she had not seen Theo this settled and this happy in years, and that whatever Adrienne was doing, she should keep doing it. Adrienne drove home that night with Theo's hand resting easily on hers on the console between them, and thought, with something like wonder, about how different this quiet, steady kind of love felt from anything she had known before, and how she no longer had to convince herself that easy and safe were somehow less real than dramatic and uncertain. Nearly 14 months after the divorce was finalized, Adrienne received a call at her office that she almost let go to voicemail out of habit before something made her pick up. It was Catherine Boyd, calling with an update Adrienne had not asked for and had not particularly wanted. Preston had ultimately pleaded guilty to a reduced fraud charge in exchange for full restitution and a suspended sentence, a plea Catherine speculated the firm had quietly negotiated for to avoid a public trial that would have exposed even more damaging detail about their own oversight failures. He had lost his professional licensing entirely, would likely never work again in private equity, and had, according to public records Catherine had stumbled across, taken a job managing inventory at a mid-sized logistics warehouse 2 counties over. Melanie had left him within a month of the firm's investigation becoming public, taking a position at a competing firm that apparently had no idea or did not particularly care about her role in the scandal. Adrienne listened to all of it with a strange, distant calm, the way one might listen to weather reports from a country she no longer lived in. She thanked Catherine, hung up, and sat for a moment in her office looking out at the city skyline, Walsh Vance Capital's tower still visible in the distance if she chose to look, which she realized, with some surprise, she had stopped doing months ago without ever consciously deciding to. She felt no satisfaction in Preston's downfall, and she felt no grief for it either. He had simply become, at some point during the quiet, steady work of rebuilding her own life, almost entirely irrelevant to it, which she assumed, that evening, would be the last she ever heard of him directly. She was wrong about that. On a Tuesday morning nearly 2 years after the divorce, her office receptionist buzzed her desk with a strange, careful tension in her voice. "Adrienne, there's a man in the lobby asking for you. He doesn't have an appointment. He says his name is Preston Walsh and he won't leave. Adrienne felt something in her chest go very still. Not fear exactly, more a kind of bracing. Tell him I'll be right down, she said, standing and smoothing her blazer, choosing, deliberately, to face this on her own terms rather than have security handle it for her, at least at first. The man waiting in her lobby barely resembled the one who had stood in that doorway 2 years earlier. He had lost significant weight, his suit clearly bought for a different, larger version of himself, his hair thinner and grayer than she remembered, his hands restless at his sides. Adrienne, he said, and his voice cracked slightly on her name. Please, I just need 5 minutes. You have 2, she said, staying near the reception desk, close enough that her team could see her, far enough that this could still remain, technically, a private conversation. I'm losing my apartment, Preston said, the words tumbling out fast, like he had rehearsed them and lost the order somewhere on the drive over. I can't find work. Nobody in this industry will touch me. The warehouse job barely covers rent, and I know I have no right to ask you for anything. I know that. But I don't have anyone else left. Melanie's gone. My uncle won't return my calls. I need $10,000, Adrienne, just to get current on rent and buy myself a little time. I'll pay you back, I swear it, with interest, whatever you want. Adrienne looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had once promised her, in a rented suit outside a small courthouse, that she would never regret choosing him, and felt something surprisingly close to nothing at all. You threw my mother's china onto a wet lawn in front of our neighbors, she said quietly, and told me I contributed nothing real to 11 years of my own life. You stole from the firm we built together to fund an apartment for the woman you replaced me with, and now you're standing in my lobby asking me to fund your recovery. I know, Preston said, tears standing openly in his eyes now. I know all of it. I was wrong. I was cruel. I don't even fully understand why I did any of it. I just know I need help, and you're the only person left who might actually give it to me. You're right that I'm the only person left, Adrienne said. But that's not evidence that I owe you anything. That's just evidence of exactly how thoroughly you burned every other bridge in your life. I'm not going to give you money, Preston. I'm not going to be cruel about it either. I hope you find your footing eventually, genuinely. But I am not your safety net anymore. I stopped being that the day you locked me out of my own study. She turned and walked back toward the elevator without waiting for a reply, and behind her, she heard him say her name once more, softer this time, almost defeated, before the elevator doors closed and carried her back up to the office she had built entirely without him. She did not tell her team the details of what had happened, only that an old matter had resolved itself, and she did not think about the encounter again, with anything sharper than a distant, settled kind of clarity. The understanding that closing a door firmly, even on someone you once loved, was sometimes the only truly healthy thing left to do. That evening, Theo found her sitting quietly on the balcony of her apartment, and she told him, plainly, exactly what had happened that morning, watching his face carefully for any flicker of the possessive anger she had half braced herself for out of old habit. He listened without interrupting, the way he always did, and when she finished he simply reached for her hand and told her that she had handled it exactly right, with more grace than the moment probably deserved. You don't owe anyone access to you, just because they finally realize what they lost, he said quietly. Especially not someone who only realized it once he needed something from you again. Adrienne leaned into his shoulder, watching the last of the daylight fade over the city, and understood, with quiet certainty, that she had finally built a life, surrounded by people who protected her peace rather than quietly chipping away at it, and that this, more than the money, more than the business, more than any single moment of vindication, was the thing her father's card had truly given her the chance to find. 2 years to the week after she had stood on that lawn holding a box of her mother's china, Adrienne stood instead on the small stage of a downtown conference center, delivering the keynote address at her own fellowship's second annual graduation ceremony. 41 women in the audience, who had each rebuilt some version of a life they thought had ended. Camille sat in the front row beside Theo, both of them watching her with the kind of open, uncomplicated pride she had spent over a decade forgetting she was allowed to receive from the people who loved her. She did not mention Preston by name. She did not need to. She spoke instead about her father, about a matte black card carried silently in a wallet for 9 years. about the exact moment a person realizes the ground beneath them was never actually as unstable as someone else had convinced them it was. "I used to believe my worth was something someone else got to decide," she told the room, Theo watching from the second row, with an expression she had long since stopped needing to interpret carefully, because she finally, fully trusted it. "I don't believe that anymore. None of you should either. Every woman in this room walked in here after someone tried to convince her she was starting from zero. I want you to hear this clearly. You were never starting from zero. You were starting from yourself, and it turns out that was always more than enough." The applause that followed was warm and sustained, and afterward dozens of women came up to shake her hand, to share pieces of their own stories, to ask what came next for Coleman's Sterling Advisory, and Adrienne answered every single question, because she remembered exactly what it felt like to stand somewhere new and desperately want proof that rebuilding was actually possible. Near the end of the reception, Bethany Cruz found her way through the crowd, no longer the shaking, frightened woman from that first intake appointment 2 years earlier, and introduced Adrienne to the toddler on her hip, telling her, simply, that she had wanted her daughter to grow up knowing exactly what it looked like when a woman refused to stay small. Odette was there too, arriving late from a full morning at her bakery, pressing a small box of cookies into Adrienne's hands, with the same note tucked inside that she had sent that very first time, because some gratitude, she said, was worth saying twice. Marisol found her near the drinks table toward the end of the evening, holding 2 glasses of sparkling cider, and handed one over without a word, before finally saying what she had apparently been meaning to say all night. "I almost didn't come to that first interview," Marisol admitted. "I'd talked myself out of it twice that morning. I keep thinking about what would have happened if I'd stayed home that day instead." Adrienne squeezed her arm gently. "You didn't stay home, though. That's really the whole point of everything we're building here, isn't it? Showing up anyway, even when every old voice in your head is telling you not to bother." Marisol smiled, glancing across the room at Priya, now confidently working the crowd of graduates and their families in her own right, and at Denise, deep in conversation with one of the newest fellowship cohort members about opening her first solo checking account. "It's a good room to stand in," Marisol said simply, and Adrienne agreed completely. Adrienne stayed until the last guest had left, helping Priya and Denise fold up chairs in a mostly empty conference hall, the 3 of them laughing about nothing in particular, the way people do when a long, meaningful day is finally winding down. Driving home afterward with Theo beside her in the passenger seat, the city lights sliding past the windows, Adrienne thought back, without any real pain attached to the memory anymore, to a woman standing on a wet lawn 2 years earlier, holding a box of her mother's china, certain in that moment that her entire life had just been taken from her. It had not been taken from her at all, she understood now. It had simply been waiting, quietly, for her to finally walk through the door her father had built for her 32 years before she ever needed it, and to discover, on the other side of it, exactly how much of herself she still had left to find. If Adrienne's story moved you today, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what we're bringing you next. And drop a comment telling us which part hit hardest. We genuinely read every one, and it helps us know exactly which stories to tell next.